Some men aren't built to survive prison. Others were born for it. These 5 killers didn't wait to finish their sentence. They finished someone else's. In the middle of concrete walls, locked doors, and constant eyes, they found ways to turn meals into traps, beds into graves, and cellmates into corpses. They didn't kill for freedom. They killed because they could. Before I tell you how they killed inmates, tell us where you're watching from and what time it is right now. And don't forget to subscribe, because in these stories, justice wasn't handed out by judges. It came from inside. Raiden Pike wasn't the kind of man prison changed. He was the kind of man it revealed. Before his incarceration, he'd already had blood on his hands from bar fights, an armed robbery gone sideways, and the sudden chilling murder of a gas station attendant who refused to hand over the till fast enough. But it was inside the high walls of Texas's Garrett State Penitentiary that Raiden found his real calling, not in violence for profit or survival, but in something colder, calculated revenge. Not the hot, reckless kind that made you scream and throw punches, but the kind that took its time, that waited in silence, smiling politely until the perfect moment to strike. Raiden had been locked up for 18 years when he received the letter. A yellowed envelope with no return address slipped into his commissary by a sympathetic guard who had a habit of turning a blind eye to Raiden's affairs in exchange for favors. Some drugs here, a scare tactic there. The letter was from a nurse at a juvenile facility in Waco where Raiden's younger brother Micah had died 3 years prior. Officially, it had been listed as suicide, hanging in the shower with a braided bed sheet, but the nurse confessed it was no accident. Micah had been targeted for weeks by older boys in the block, and the ringleader was someone she never forgot, Dwight Archer. Back then, Dwight was 16 and already built like a middleweight boxer, in for stabbing his stepfather with a barbecue skewer during a 4th of July cookout. He wasn't just brutal, he was cruel. Micah had been smaller, weaker, and Raiden had spent years blaming himself for not being there. The moment he read that name, the moment the ink sank into the paper like it was sinking into his spine, Raiden Pike stopped being a prisoner. He became a hunter. The twist? Dwight Archer had grown up, been arrested again, this time for battery and attempted kidnapping, and was now serving 20 years in the exact same prison. Cell Block C, 2 levels above Raiden's current assignment. Prison wasn't big, but it was layered with rules, surveillance, and danger. You didn't just get near someone because you wanted to. You had to build a path. Raiden started small, asking to be reassigned to food prep, knowing it would give him access to more movement through the corridors. He kept his head down, offered guards respectful nods, and waited for disciplinary transfers to open opportunities. After 6 months, he got his break. A riot in the South Yard shifted several inmates into temporary cells, and Raiden used an old favor with a senior guard to be moved upstairs, 1 block closer. Still not close enough to act, but close enough to observe. And he did, obsessively. Dwight had gotten older, but not wiser. He still carried himself like he was owed respect, still barked orders, and still bullied weaker inmates for extra trays and commissary handouts. Raiden watched the way Dwight strutted down the corridor, the hand he used to press the wall when turning corners, the way he always scratched the back of his neck when talking to guards. Nervous tick, maybe trauma, maybe just rot bubbling under the skin. He even noted what time Dwight took his medications and where he hid his contraband, under the 4th tile in the shower room's leftmost stall. Raiden memorized every detail not because he had to, but because it made the kill personal. This wasn't rage. This was ritual. He began crafting his weapon the way a man might carve a tombstone, deliberate, quiet, and with reverence. A toothbrush melted at the end and sharpened with a stolen nail file into a jagged, curved point. Not just for stabbing, but for slicing with maximum tearing. He wrapped the handle in gauze to keep it from slipping and hid it beneath the foam of his mattress, stitched closed with dental floss. The tool wasn't fancy, but it was meant to be felt. And then came the hardest part: timing. Raiden needed Dwight isolated, vulnerable, off his rhythm. That moment came 2 weeks later, when Dwight was jumped by a group of Aryan Brotherhood inmates over a debt and landed in the infirmary with bruised ribs and a cracked orbital bone. He'd be out of general population for 3 days, alone, sedated, and watched only loosely by underpaid medical staff. Raiden immediately feigned stomach cramps and vomiting, using a bar of soap and lukewarm water to induce the symptoms. He collapsed in the mess hall during lunch and was transferred to the same infirmary wing. The moment he was wheeled in, he scanned the beds and saw Dwight, half asleep, wearing a cold compress over his face, IV dripping slowly into his arm. Raiden didn't look at him. He didn't need to. He already knew what came next. It was just past 2 a.m. when Raiden Pike opened his eyes to the sound of controlled breathing. The infirmary was dim, lit only by a flickering wall sconce near the medication shelf, and 3 of the 6 beds were occupied, one by a diabetic lifer named Nelson who snored like a freight train, another by a drug detox patient shaking beneath 2 blankets, and the third by Dwight Archer, the man Raiden had built his entire second life around. He didn't rise immediately. Instead, he lay still, synchronizing his breath with Nelson's snores, waiting for the night nurse to finish her round, which she did at exactly 2:07 a.m. He had counted the routine the night before. She scribbled her last note, locked the cabinet, and disappeared into her office at the far end of the wing, shutting the door with a click so soft it almost broke Raiden's focus. Almost. The shank was already taped beneath the bed frame. He had rigged it earlier during his fake nausea episode. He reached under the metal slats and peeled back the tape, taking the weapon into his palm. It was warm, almost eager. He padded silently across the tile floor, each footstep absorbed by the thin socks he wore instead of prison-issue shoes. Dwight was laid out sideways, blanket pushed halfway off, one arm extended toward the IV, face turned toward the wall. Raiden stood over him for a full 20 seconds before moving. It wasn't hesitation. It was precision. He wanted this death to begin in silence. With one hand, he pressed Dwight's mouth closed, not covered, just pressed, firm and knowing. Dwight stirred, eyes fluttering, and that's when the shank went in. Not once, not twice, but a surgical, repetitive rhythm. 1, 2, 3 to the kidney, another behind the shoulder blade, 2 into the ribs, 1 straight through the throat. No screams, just wet, gurgled surprise. Dwight's hands clawed at Raiden's arms, but he was weakened by sedatives and confusion. The final blow went into his left eye, angling upward with such force that the toothbrush snapped at the base. Raiden didn't flinch. He let the weapon break, let it stay. He pressed Dwight's body back down into the sheets as it spasmed, then stilled. The whole thing took less than 40 seconds. He wiped his hands on the inside of the infirmary blanket, pulled the sheet up to Dwight's chin, and turned away like a nurse who had just tucked in a patient. But the real brilliance wasn't in the kill. It was in the cleanup. Raiden used a hospital glove, pocketed earlier, to pick up the weapon hilt and tucked it into the biohazard bin, buried under used gauze and soiled medical tape. He then pulled out his emergency tool, a capped needle with a small pouch of blood, his own, drawn slowly over weeks via a borrowed syringe from a diabetic inmate. He carefully smeared this blood across the floor, leading away from Dwight's bed, toward the detox patient 2 rows down. It wouldn't frame him for murder, but it would create enough confusion to delay questions. Then he washed his hands at the sink, used alcohol wipes to clean beneath his nails, and returned to bed. He lay down as if nothing had happened, heart steady, jaw slack. When the nurse re-entered at 3:12 a.m. for her next round, she noticed the silence first. Dwight had stopped snoring. She approached and froze. It wasn't the blood that caught her, it was the smell, that metallic, ripe tang of something irreversible. Within 60 seconds, the infirmary was in lockdown. Guards stormed in, lights flashed, alarms buzzed like wasps. But Raiden? Raiden sat up slowly, blinking in confusion like a man awakened from a dream. They checked his hands. Clean. They asked questions. "I was sleeping," he said. "Didn't hear a thing." And for the most part, that was true. He had slept through it, right after orchestrating a perfect, nearly bloodless kill. The first suspicion naturally fell on the detox patient, who had a long history of psychotic episodes and had apparently screamed in his sleep shortly after 2 a.m. A quick search found blood near his bed, Raiden's planted smear, and the guards latched onto the theory like flies to rot. But the evidence didn't hold. Dwight had been stabbed in ways that required strength and intention. The detox guy could barely lift his arms. Soon, the questions widened. Rumors began to circle. Whispers that Raiden and Dwight had a history. Whispers that Raiden had moved cells too conveniently close. Whispers that someone had seen him talking to a nurse. Whispers about the broken shank in Dwight's eye and how it matched the shape of Raiden's missing toothbrush. But whispers weren't proof. They interrogated him twice, brought in lie detectors, which Raiden passed, and eventually chalked the murder up to inmate rivalry, unresolved. Raiden wasn't transferred, wasn't charged, wasn't even written up. He went back to food prep 2 weeks later, and yet he didn't celebrate. He didn't brag. He didn't smirk in the yard or strut like a man who got away with something. That wasn't his nature. Instead, he sat alone most days, peeling carrots and staring out at the high fences. The kill hadn't satisfied him. It had simply removed a burden. Dwight Archer was dead. Micah's ghost was quieter. The world hadn't changed, but the air felt different, lighter. And Raiden Pike, known in some corners now as the Orderly, never killed again. He didn't need to. His one kill had been perfect, silent, surgical, forgotten by the world, but not by the man who'd waited 18 years to make it happen. The murder of Dwight Archer didn't spark a riot. It didn't ignite war between cells. It didn't even crack the surface of the evening news. But inside Cell Block G, the air shifted permanently. There was no funeral, of course, no service. No grief counselors for inmates. Dwight's body was wheeled out under a white sheet, logged in a short report as stab wounds, suspected inmate conflict, and cremated without ceremony. What remained of him was a small envelope of ashes sent to a sister he hadn't spoken to in 12 years. But among prisoners, Dwight's death was whispered about in the same tone men use for haunted places or broken stairwells. Low, half fearful, and never too close to the truth. Everyone knew Raiden had done it, but no one could prove it. That made him dangerous, not just violent, but capable. Capable in a way few men in that prison were. He wasn't a loudmouth. He wasn't a gang member or a musclehead. He was a man who had waited years, played the part of a model inmate, then killed like he was clocking into a job. That shook people. It rewired their instincts. Men who used to nod at him now avoided his gaze. The poker games stopped. The usual catcalling and loud mess hall chatter dulled around him. He became something else, not a monster, but an operator. A man with a silent, lethal rhythm. Even the guards treated him differently. Sergeant Wallace, who used to bark orders like a drill sergeant, lowered his voice when Raiden was around. Nurses checked vitals faster. Even the warden's weekly walkthrough paused just a little longer at Raiden's table, as if to measure what couldn't be filed in a folder. But the strangest part was how unchanged Raiden seemed. After the murder, he returned to routine as if nothing had ever happened. Wake up, make his bed, help prep lunch, read in the library, play chess against himself using salt and pepper packets. His eyes didn't darken. His shoulders didn't tense. If anything, he seemed lighter, like he had finally paid off an old loan. But something in him had shifted. He stopped writing letters. His books changed, from thrillers and crime novels to psychology, history, and anatomy. He requested textbooks from the prison education program and spent his afternoons studying nerve clusters and pressure points, not to plan more murders, but because understanding the body had given him power once, and he wasn't ready to give that power up. He never spoke of Dwight again, never confessed, never bragged. But over time, a strange myth formed around him. Stories spread, quietly, with no clear source, that Raiden had once been a doctor before prison, that he had killed not one man, but 3, that he could stop your heart with a pencil jab to the spine, that he walked into Dwight's cell and paralyzed him before he even moved. None of that was true, but it didn't matter. The fear was. Younger inmates began watching him like he was a ghost, real but untouchable. Older cons gave him wide berth. Even guards began using him as a threat. Keep screwing around and we'll send you to Pike's block. It was both joke and warning. But Raiden didn't thrive on the fear. In fact, he began to disappear, not physically, but spiritually. He spoke less, kept to corners, took cleaning jobs in the early hours when most inmates were asleep. He began refusing commissary, gave up sweets, gave away most of his books. He was simplifying himself, like a man folding in on his own center. Some thought it was guilt, others thought it was strategy. But no one could tell for sure, and then came the cancer. It started in the liver, moved fast, and by the time they found it, he had less than 5 months. The prison doctor gave him morphine. Raiden refused it, said he wanted clarity, said he'd already slept enough in this life. He spent those last months on a hospice bed near the laundry wing, surrounded by bleach smells and the distant hum of dryers. No visitors, no letters, no priest. Just one man watching his clock run down, expression unreadable. He never confessed to Dwight's murder. When asked, officially or not, he said, "What's done doesn't change by naming it." His death was quiet. No struggle, no theatrics. Just an exhale at 3:44 a.m., one hand resting on his stomach, the other curled beneath the blanket. No one claimed the body. His ashes were added to the prison's unmarked field. But in the years that followed, stories about Raiden Pike only deepened. Some said he left behind a coded notebook hidden in the library walls. Others claimed he trained 2 younger inmates in pressure point combat. Some guards even whispered that Pike had helped balance the prison by eliminating a toxic figure and doing it clean. Whatever the truth, one fact remained. Raiden Pike killed only once. But that one kill rewrote an entire prison's balance. And whether justice, vengeance, or silence was the motive, he made sure it was surgical, deliberate, and unforgettable. But prisons don't stay quiet for long. The silence Raiden Pike left behind wasn't peace, it was a vacuum. And in places like these, vacuums attract darker things. His story faded from memory, reduced to a cautionary nod in training manuals and whispered warnings during new inmate orientation. But just 2 years after his final breath, a different kind of predator took shape in the same system. One who didn't wait for peace, one who hunted inside chaos. If Pike was a scalpel, the next man was a hammer. Loud, brutal, and unstoppable once he picked a target. His name was Carson Vel. Inmates called him Steelmouth, not because of any dental implants or metal teeth, but because of the way he clenched his jaw like iron whenever he was about to explode. He wasn't the biggest man in the yard, nor the fastest, but everyone learned quick that Carson didn't bluff. Born in Detroit, raised in a system of shelters and group homes, Carson had already stabbed 2 people before he turned 15. By 23, he was serving a life sentence for killing his foster father, not in self-defense, but in what the court described as ritualized vengeance. According to transcripts, Carson tied the man to a chair, made him confess on tape to years of abuse, and then choked him to death with his own belt while the tape kept rolling. That tape, bizarrely, became evidence and warning. But inside Midway Correctional Facility, nobody cared about his past. They cared about his present, how he carried himself, how he stared at you like he was peeling skin with his eyes, and how he smiled just before violence. Carson wasn't impulsive. That's what made him terrifying. He waited, like a fire in a sealed room, for oxygen, for an excuse, for betrayal. And inside prison, betrayal was always on sale. Favors, snitches, lost respect, stolen food. It didn't take much. What made Carson different was who he targeted. Not rival gang members, not racist guards, not random weaklings. Carson hunted men who preyed on others. He had a code, twisted, incomplete, and entirely his own, but a code nonetheless. Rapists, extortionists, inmate snitches, men who used their bunkmates' weaknesses as leverage. These were his prey. He didn't announce his intentions, didn't brag, didn't warn. But when word came down the tiers that someone had been caught blackmailing a younger inmate for commissary in exchange for protection, Carson didn't let it slide. He watched, waited, smiled in the mess hall like a man already rehearsing a eulogy. His first prison kill was Warren Fitch, a wiry man with slicked back hair and a permanently crooked nose from an old baseball bat injury. Fitch had been running a small racket on the third tier, trading sleeping pills and commissary food to the mentally fragile in exchange for humiliating favors. Foot rubs, back scratches, emotional confessions that he'd later repeat to others as jokes. He was a parasite, and Carson had marked him. It started with kindness. That was Carson's trap, the slow burn of friendliness. He helped Warren lift a mattress once, shared half a honey bun, talked to him about music, 80s rock, apparently a shared interest. Fitch liked being liked. He liked feeling in control. He didn't recognize that Carson was already building the frame of a coffin around him. 2 weeks later, when Fitch let his guard down and agreed to cut Carson's hair, something inmates sometimes did as barter, Carson made his move. The barber setup gave him the perfect angle. A seated man, facing away, draped in a towel, holding still. Carson used a melted-down toothbrush sharpened into a spike and driven into a carved wooden handle, an improvised stiletto that passed through metal detectors because of its lack of alloy. He struck once at the base of the skull, a soft spot beneath the occipital bone, then 3 more times in quick succession. Silent. No mess. Fitch's body slumped forward, eyes still open, mouth parting like he was about to tell a joke. Carson wrapped the towel around his head and called for a guard. He claimed a seizure. It bought him exactly 90 seconds before anyone noticed the blood pooling under the chair. By then, the weapon had already been flushed. The towel had already been dropped in the laundry chute. The guards found nothing. Fitch was dead. Carson, he was clean. Just a haircut gone wrong, he told investigators with a half smile that made their stomachs turn. They couldn't prove anything. No prints, no witnesses, no motive anyone could pin. Fitch, after all, was universally disliked. A quiet party buzzed across the cell block that night. Not celebration, but acknowledgement. Carson had drawn his first blood behind bars, and he'd gotten away with it. That changed everything. Suddenly, he wasn't just another inmate. He was a predator of predators, a prison executioner. It was the way he killed that made people nervous. Not rage-fueled, not messy, not ego-driven. Surgical, precise. And, most disturbingly, with a kind of moral clarity. He never attacked at random. He stalked, learned routines, listened to conversations like a shark gliding just beneath the surface. Over time, his name spread through the system. Guards warned transfers about him. Inmates gave wide berth, And when another predator started shaking down an old man in the showers for pain meds, Carson began whistling again, that same eerie tune he'd hummed before killing Fitch. It was his tell, not a threat, not a promise. Just a low, off-key lullaby that signaled someone had been chosen. The system didn't know what to do with him. He wasn't a gang member. He didn't fit the psychotic profile. He passed evaluations. He followed most rules. And yet, the body count whispered his truth. Carson Vel wasn't just surviving prison. He was cleansing it, one target at a time. And the worst part? Some inmates thought he was doing the right thing. The second body didn't come quickly, and that was by design. Carson Vel knew that predators who struck too often eventually lost their teeth, or worse, their camouflage. So he waited. 46 days passed. In that time, Carson returned to normal routines. He read from the prison library, mostly war memoirs and forensic science texts. He attended 3 therapy sessions, said very little, but listened intently. When the guards looked at him, they saw a model inmate, cold, quiet, careful. But inside, Carson was patient, not because he was calm, but because he was planning something larger. The opportunity came with the arrival of a new transfer from St. Francis Correctional, a short, snake-eyed inmate named Jalen Torrance. Torrance had a history. He was known for manipulating mentally ill inmates into giving up their food or medication in exchange for false promises of protection. Even more disturbingly, rumors followed him. Whispers of sexual abuse, veiled threats, and guards turning a blind eye. Carson watched him work. It took Torrance 2 weeks to start preying on a vulnerable inmate from protective custody who had just been moved into general population due to overcrowding. The young man, barely 20 with a stutter and scars down both arms, had been caught crying in the shower. Carson didn't say anything. He simply started counting. The interactions, the body language, the way Torrance began cornering the kid near the laundry cages where cameras didn't reach. It was enough. The trap was set during laundry duty. Carson volunteered for laundry the same day as Torrance, knowing exactly how to arrange it. He swapped assignments, bribed a guard with cigarettes to avoid supervision for 10 minutes, and made sure the protective custody inmate was reassigned to another task for the day. That left Torrance alone in the folding area, a narrow room with no cameras and only one exit. Carson walked in calm, holding a bag of clean towels. Torrance looked up and smirked. "What, playing house today?" he said. Carson didn't answer. He placed the towels on the metal table, turned his back, and then struck. The weapon this time was a broken mop handle, sharpened into a jagged edge and hidden inside a rolled-up laundry bag. Carson swung once, catching Torrance across the side of the head, a blow that shattered part of his orbital bone. As Torrance staggered and screamed, Carson closed the distance and drove the mop shaft into his neck, pinning him against the wall. The screams stopped, blood sprayed across the linen. Carson held the pressure until he felt the twitching stop, then calmly walked to the sink, washed his hands, and waited for the guard rotation. When questioned, Carson claimed Torrance had tried to assault him. There were no cameras, no witnesses, just a corpse and Carson's version of the story. It wasn't self-defense, everyone knew that, but it wasn't provable murder either. The inmate he'd protected refused to talk. Maybe out of fear, maybe out of loyalty. No one pressed too hard. The prison moved Carson to administrative segregation, solitary, but not for punishment, for investigative purposes. He stayed there 87 days. During that time, Carson wrote in a journal every day, detailing names, offenses, moral equations, who deserved pain, who deserved protection. It read like a manifesto or a doctrine, but he never signed it. When he was finally released back into general population, a quiet change had taken place. He was no longer just feared, he was mythologized. Some called him a vigilante, others called him a necessary evil. The guards didn't like him, but they tolerated him. The warden once said, We can't prosecute a shadow. But Carson wasn't hiding. He simply became more careful. His third kill came 6 months later, involving an older inmate who ran a low-key gambling ring and extorted inmates for losses, demanding interest in ways that bordered on sexual coercion. Carson didn't kill this man with violence. He laced his water with crushed lithium stolen from the infirmary, triggering a seizure during recreation. When staff found him, his head was bleeding from where it hit the concrete. They ruled it accidental. Carson's fingerprints were never found. His cell was clean. He didn't gloat, didn't change behavior. He just went back to whistling that same off-key lullaby while he worked in the kitchen. He was now 3 for 3, and no one could stop him. Eventually, the administration moved him again, not for punishment, but containment. He was transferred to a supermax facility upstate where cameras ran 24/7, and prisoners were allowed only 30 minutes of yard time alone. There, Carson didn't kill again, or at least not in ways they could prove. Rumors followed that another inmate had a stroke after a shared meal, that a guard resigned after being caught destroying evidence connected to Carson. But officially, his record showed no further incidents. Then, one morning, Carson didn't show up for his psych evaluation. Guards went to his cell. It was empty. The door was locked. Cameras showed nothing. His bed was made, his journal gone, his shoes still under the bunk. A single line was scrawled on the wall in soap: "Monsters die in light." An internal investigation was launched. No escape tunnel, no footage, no explanation. Some believed he faked suicide and had help from staff to vanish. Others believed he was murdered by guards and quietly removed. But no body was found. Carson Vel disappeared into the air, leaving behind 3 bodies, a doctrine of selective violence, and a prison system too ashamed to admit he ever existed. And still, in 2 facilities, inmates swear they hear whistling some nights, off-key, just beyond the door. If Carson Vel made violence into theater, then the next man turned it into scripture, silent, sacred, and methodical. Elias Granger wasn't loud. He wasn't feared for his fists or for the chaos he caused in open space. He was feared for something colder, the way he sat in chapel, unmoving, hands folded, staring into nothing. A man who spoke in parables and metaphors, but when you looked into his eyes, it wasn't God you saw. It was calculation. Before prison, Elias had once been a theology student in northern Indiana. His crime, the one that got him inside, was so quiet, so buried in ritual, that many believed it wasn't even about the act of killing, but about what came after. He was sentenced to life without parole for strangling his younger brother in the middle of a staged exorcism, insisting it was divine correction. But prison didn't strip him down, it gave him structure. Elias walked the cell block like a monk, memorizing footsteps, studying inmates who smuggled in narcotics, who disrespected elders, who mocked the religious volunteers. He called them desecrators, and he had a list, a quiet one. He never wrote it down, he recited it during prayer. His killings didn't begin immediately. He waited months, observed. When the first death happened, an overdose in cell 3B, no one questioned it. But the second, a man found hanging from a torn bedsheet tied to his ankles, raised an eyebrow. Elias was always nearby but never involved. Guards noted how inmates seemed afraid of him, not because he fought, but because he watched. When he spoke to his targets, it was never in anger. It was in whispers. "Forgive me." They'd nod. And then a week later, they'd vanish, found during cell checks, lifeless, with no clear sign of struggle. He lured them by posing as a spiritual listener, offering to cleanse their guilt through meditation and penance. He listened to their confessions, then acted as their judge. His weapon of choice was patience, no blades, no blood, just deprivation, suffocation, and the manipulation of routine. He would wait until lockdown, predict the guards' rotation, and leave almost no sign except one, a torn strip of white cloth in the shape of a cross. By the time his third victim was discovered, mouth taped shut, eyes wide open, no sign of injury, prison officials began to fear they had something worse than a gang enforcer on their hands. They had a believer, and believers don't stop. The silence around Elias Granger grew louder with each disappearance. By the fourth body, even the toughest inmates refused to sit near him during meals. He became a myth inside Cell Block D, a man who didn't raise his voice, didn't run, didn't sweat, and yet left behind only death. His victims weren't random. They were repeat offenders in the chapel registry, men who mocked the chaplain, disrespected faith-based programming, or refused Elias's offers of redemption sessions. The staff labeled them as discipline risks, but Elias saw them as unrepentant souls. The fourth body, a man known as Hicks who once bragged about stabbing a pastor on the outside, was found curled up in a fetal position inside a laundry cart, eyes wide and dry. There were no signs of struggle, only a rosary bead embedded deep in his throat, as if swallowed in panic or penance. That detail shattered the silence. Guards tore apart Elias's cell, found nothing, no rope, no drugs, no tools. Only a Bible, dog-eared and annotated in furious red ink with verses circled, "Vengeance is mine, I will repay." Surveillance footage showed Elias entering the chapel at 7:04 p.m. Hicks had followed. No footage after that. Lights out at 9. Hicks was gone by morning. That's when Warden Keller called in external investigators, a behavioral profiler, a forensic pathologist, and a retired prison chaplain. Together, they began building a pattern. Victims interacted with Elias days before death. Each victim had received a folded note, signed simply with EG inside, Bible verses paired with vague threats about redemption through suffering. One guard who got too curious, Officer Delaney, was found unconscious in the stairwell with no memory of what happened. But Elias was clever. He never touched him. Cameras showed Elias walking calmly to the infirmary, reporting Delaney's condition before anyone else noticed. The act made him look like a hero, but to the investigators, it felt like a taunt. Elias began pushing limits. His fifth victim was an inmate housed 3 cells away, not one of his usual chapel contacts. But Elias had heard him brag about conning a religious non-profit to reduce his sentence. The man was found kneeling in prayer position, hands tied behind his back, a page from a Bible forced into his mouth, Psalm 94. They slay the widow and the stranger and murder the fatherless. The act sent shockwaves. Inmates demanded transfers. The warden initiated full lockdown. No more chapel time, no more religious materials. But Elias didn't protest. He simply waited. And during that waiting, someone finally broke. A cellmate who had shared space with Elias for 2 weeks. He confessed that Elias whispered at night, not prayers, but plans, descriptions of upcoming targets. He even described how Elias used fragments of toothbrush handles shaved into soft, pliable cords, strong enough to constrict airflow but flexible enough to vanish after use. When questioned, Elias denied everything with a faint smile and a quote, "Many are called, few are chosen." But his control was slipping. On the 6th attempt, he miscalculated. A guard walked in early during a cell check and caught Elias mid-act, standing behind another inmate with a makeshift cord drawn tightly around the neck, both men frozen in the spotlight of the hallway floodlight. The guard shouted. Backup rushed in. Elias didn't run. He slowly released the grip, raised his hands, and dropped to his knees. When asked why, he said only, he was too far gone. That was the last time Elias was seen on general population floors. He was moved to solitary, transferred to a federal mental health facility, and eventually declared criminally insane. But among inmates and guards alike, his legend remained. Some say he converted his psychiatric evaluator to his beliefs. Others say he disappeared during a routine transfer, that no facility ever received him. What's certain is this: Elias Granger didn't kill for power or chaos. He killed for conviction, a twisted form of spiritual justice. And for every step forward law enforcement took, he had already memorized the next 10. His story faded from headlines, but never from the corridors of prison rumor. In Cell Block D, new inmates are still told, if a man offers you peace and a Bible quote, say no. Elias Granger believed in righteous vengeance, but the next man didn't believe in redemption at all, only in the raw satisfaction of revenge. Where Elias was calm and methodical, this man was volcanic. A former enforcer turned inmate who didn't need verses to justify what he did. All he needed was a memory, a name, a date, a betrayal that left blood on the floor. And inside those prison walls, he wasn't searching for peace. He was waiting for the right time to destroy the people who put him there. His name was Marcus Thorne, and in prison, he wasn't just feared, he was studied. Born in Atlanta in 1971, Marcus grew up in the chaos of fractured gangs and broken homes. By the time he was 15, he had already survived 3 stabbings and orchestrated his own retaliation by leading a teenage extortion crew out of an abandoned auto body shop. But it wasn't the streets that hardened him, it was betrayal. At 22, he took the fall for a failed robbery planned by 2 men he trusted like brothers. When the cops raided the safe house, Marcus was left behind, holding the bag and bleeding from a shot fired by someone who was supposed to have his back. He spent the next 25 years in a maximum security facility thinking about those 2 men, and the day they were finally brought in, after years of separate charges, Marcus didn't waste a minute. What made him different from other killers was how little he cared about cover. He didn't want to vanish. He wanted to be remembered. He didn't wait until lights out. He didn't strike from the shadows. He challenged both men in front of the entire cell block. He greeted them like old friends, pulled them in for a hug, and then jabbed a filed down spork deep into one of their livers. The scream was guttural. The guards rushed in, but Marcus didn't run. He backed into the wall, hands up, smiling, eyes locked on the second man. "One down," he said. "One to go." After solitary confinement, prison protocol dictated he be relocated to a different facility. What they didn't anticipate was Marcus's patience. 2 years passed. He played along, took part in mandatory therapy sessions, helped out in the kitchen, even attended grievance circles. But inside, he watched, waited. The second man, Darnell, had been transferred to the same complex under protective classification. But Marcus knew the system too well. He got himself reassigned to Darnell's wing by volunteering for janitorial duty, and during that time, crafted a key out of melted toothbrush resin and paper clips, a crude but effective skeleton key that allowed him access to the back hallway near Darnell's cell. On a cold November night, while most of the prison watched a televised boxing match in the rec hall, Marcus slipped into the shadows. He reached Darnell's cell, opened the slot, and released a canister he'd rigged using ammonia and powdered soap, a suffocating chemical mix he'd learned about in a maintenance manual. While Darnell choked and stumbled out, Marcus stepped in and used a snapped broom handle, sharpened at one end, to deliver precise, brutal blows. He left the weapon behind, along with a note that read only, "Never leave a brother bleeding." That murder changed the tone of the prison. Marcus wasn't viewed as a monster. He was whispered about like a cautionary legend. Other inmates respected him. Some even admired the loyalty of his vengeance. But the staff saw him as an escalating risk. They tightened procedures, banned homemade cleaning tools, and rotated guards in Marcus's wing every 3 days. Yet none of that stopped him, because Marcus had developed a taste, not for blood, but for balance. After Darnell, his targets weren't tied to his own past. They were men he deemed as treacherous, snitches, manipulators, those who preyed on weaker inmates. His next victim was a lifer named Kelson, known for secretly recording fellow inmates' confessions in exchange for reduced sentences. Marcus found a way to access Kelson's cell by setting off the sprinkler system 2 floors up, which distracted officers long enough for Marcus to sneak down using the laundry chute access tunnel. Inside Kelson's cell, he waited under the bunk, silent, still, with a weapon forged from dismantled coat hangers. When Kelson entered and turned his back, Marcus struck. Quick, targeted punctures, neck, abdomen, under the ribs, each one calculated. The man was dead before he hit the floor. Marcus wrote nothing this time. His silence spoke enough. And yet again, the investigation turned up nothing concrete. The prison system tried to move him again, but he refused food, refused conversation, staged medical collapses, until they kept him in place to avoid triggering a full breakdown. That's how he stayed close enough to kill again. Every move Marcus made was deliberate, fueled not by madness, but by clarity. He didn't lash out randomly. He calculated risk, timed his strikes with facility blind spots, and left just enough confusion behind to avoid solitary for too long. And what made him even more dangerous was his ability to twist morality into justification. He believed he was cleaning the prison, ridding it of snakes and parasites. Each kill was a favor to those left behind. By the time the 5th body dropped, an inmate named Trujillo, found hanging but with neck wounds inconsistent with suicide, investigators pushed for federal transfer. But Marcus vanished. Not in thin air, just from paper. No transfer logs, no transport documentation. Just a note left behind in his old cell. "I'm not done." Rumors say he was placed in a black site detention wing, buried so deep in the system that even guards need special clearance. Others believe he escaped during a failed transfer, helped by a guard he once saved from being stabbed. Either way, his name was erased from rosters, redacted from documents, whispered in training sessions only as a myth. But inside that prison system, his memory remains, not just as a killer, but as a man who made revenge look like justice. The legend of Marcus Thorne didn't end when the logs stopped. If anything, that's when it truly began. By the time his file was quietly marked as transferred, status sealed, the whispers among inmates had already grown into doctrine. New arrivals were warned not about gangs or guards, but about the invisible hand of Marcus. Some said he walked through walls. Others claimed he was granted free roam by officials who feared him more than they cared about their rules. But the truth, if there was such a thing anymore, was far more dangerous. Marcus hadn't escaped prison. He had simply mastered it. For him, the walls weren't a cage. They were camouflage. In the final year before his full disappearance, Marcus turned from reactive vengeance to proactive selection. He built a quiet network, not of friends, but of watchers. Inmates who owed him favors, guards who he helped blackmail-proof their side hustles, kitchen staff who saw things they were never supposed to. With every whisper that reached his ears, Marcus built dossiers. He began to catalog what he called the rot. Inmates who raped cellmates under the threat of silence, men who stole from commissary accounts of elderly prisoners, lifers who faked suicidal ideation to get vulnerable cellmates placed in their bunk for abuse. These weren't just bad men, they were system manipulators, parasites, and Marcus believed he was the cure. His method shifted. No longer content with crude weapons or loud statements, he started experimenting with slow violence. One victim, a man named Harlow, was poisoned over the course of 3 weeks. Marcus used a blend of kitchen chemicals, shaving off bleach tablets, soaking them in tea bags, and lacing instant noodles. Each dose was just enough to build nausea, headaches, and paranoia. By the time Harlow collapsed in the yard, he was so dehydrated and disoriented that it looked like a natural failure. The coroner ruled it a combination of heat stroke and stress. Marcus never smiled. He just updated his mental ledger. Another man, Silva, was a known extortionist who targeted older inmates for protection money. Marcus didn't attack him directly. Instead, he manipulated Silva's schedule by bribing a corrupt counselor to switch Silva's therapy appointments. On a Tuesday afternoon, Silva found himself alone in the south hallway, a blind spot during shift change. Marcus was waiting. This time he used a retractable utility knife smuggled from a cleaning supply closet and hidden in the sole of his boot. He made no sound. One cut across the femoral artery, one palm over the mouth. Blood soaked the floor tiles in silence. Marcus didn't linger. He washed his hands in the janitor's sink and returned to the chapel, where he sat through an entire sermon about forgiveness. The guards found Silva 20 minutes later. Marcus was never questioned. He had an alibi and witnesses, but those who paid attention started to notice the pattern. Deaths were getting cleaner. The chaos was gone. Inmates were dying without cause, without warning, without mess, and Marcus, always quiet, always composed, seemed just a bit too centered. It wasn't long before Warden Briggs initiated a special operations review. Surveillance footage was pulled, heat signatures tracked, meal schedules audited. But Marcus was never caught on tape. He understood camera angles, used reflective surfaces to blind the lenses, and timed his movements down to the minute. He even trained his gait to mimic others. If a security analyst tried to ID him by posture or walk, they'd mistake him for a dozen others. In a place built on patterns, Marcus had become the anomaly. His greatest advantage wasn't his violence, it was his ability to convince everyone that he was cured. He met with prison psychologists and fed them stories about childhood trauma, about forgiveness, about letting go. He even cried once during a session, talking about his mother's death. It was performance art at its highest form. Just enough truth laced with just enough fiction to pass every evaluation. When they granted him access to a mentor program for reformed inmates, he used it as a recruitment pipeline. Not to train others in violence, but to gather information. He used chessboards to mask surveillance. He asked questions like, "How's your bunkie treating you?" and "You trust the guy running the rec games?" Inmates spilled secrets in those moments, and Marcus stored each one. His final confirmed kill, the one that triggered a quiet lockdown across the entire facility, came in the form of what looked like a suicide. An inmate named Priestley, known for exploiting mentally ill cellmates, was found hanging from a braided bedsheet tied to a ceiling vent. But the knot was too clean, the bruises on his wrists too circular. A deeper investigation revealed he'd been sedated, likely chloroformed using hand sanitizer and a rag. The only trace of the chemical was a faint odor that matched the sanitizing gel used in the medical ward. But again, there were no fingerprints, no footage, no motive, just one handwritten word carved into Priestley's metal bunk: Predator. It was Marcus's final statement. After that, he vanished from records entirely. When prison reporters tried to trace his identity, they were blocked by federal documentation that claimed his identity had been sealed under a national security clause. Some speculated that he had been recruited, used as a tool by intelligence agencies for clandestine operations overseas. Others believed he had simply been eliminated to prevent further embarrassment. The truth is more chilling. According to a leaked officer memo from 2014, Marcus Thorne was transferred to a privately funded off-site rehabilitation center, but no such center was ever found. No staff, no building, no bills. Just a ghost facility and a man whose name no longer existed in any living system. And yet, new inmates in older prisons still hear the name whispered. A few even claim he visits, that he appears in the corner of darkened cells just long enough to say, "You know what you did," and then he's gone. No camera catches it, no guard reports it. But the message is clear. Justice never left the building. It simply stopped asking permission. But for all the discipline and cold precision Marcus Thorne left behind in the echo of his vanishings, there were others who operated on a far more volatile fuel: rage, impulse, and the need to be seen. Because some killers didn't clean up their mess. They wore it like a badge. And while Marcus disappeared into myth, the next name carved his into history, using bone, fire, and a flood of blood that not even solitary confinement could contain. His name was Daryl Knox, and if every prison has a nightmare that walks upright, he was it. Not the kind that whispers or waits. Daryl was fury shaped into muscle, scars, and noise. He didn't stalk his prey. He told them what was coming, and still, no one could stop it. Before prison, Daryl had been a fireman in rural Pennsylvania. Tall, proud, decorated. But underneath the uniform was a man fraying in silence. After a house fire took the lives of 3 children and left Daryl with permanent burns across his back and shoulders, something in him twisted. Investigators later uncovered that he had deliberately sealed one of the doors shut, convinced the parents deserved punishment for neglect. He was charged with triple homicide and arson and thrown into maximum security, where the walls were thick, but not thick enough to contain his new mission. See, Daryl didn't kill for silence, he killed for theater. And in prison, his audience was always full. His first victim was his cellmate, a short, wiry drug dealer who bragged about beating his girlfriend. Daryl didn't just beat him, he sculpted the event. He waited until rec hour, planted false rumors about a fight in the yard, ensured the guards were distracted. Then he came back to the cell, calmly closed the door, and used a sharpened plastic toothbrush to gouge the man's eyes before crushing his throat with his bare hands. When the guards found the body, Daryl was shirtless, standing in the corner, covered in blood and humming a children's lullaby. He didn't deny it. He didn't explain. But he did leave behind something strange. He carved the word justice into the wall using the broken toothbrush handle. The prison thought solitary would break him, but for Daryl, it was a temple. He began planning, whispering to other inmates through air vents, listening, watching who bribed guards, who snuck in contraband, who hurt people before they got here. Daryl wasn't chaotic. He was a conductor. Each of his next killings followed a pattern: provocation, ritual, exhibition. His second victim was a known enforcer for a white supremacist gang who had once mocked a disabled inmate. Daryl baited him with an apology, offered a handmade weapon as a peace offering, and then lured him into a cleaning closet. There, with a length of stolen wire and an industrial mop handle, Daryl strangled him until his lips turned black, then hung him from a pipe as if crucified, arms out, head bowed. Once again, he left behind a message: mercy denied. The guards panicked. They started rotating his cell, transferring him to new blocks. But Daryl adapted. He used laundry duty to access new wings. He traded favors for schedules, and every time a guard or warden underestimated him, someone died. The tools were always improvised: melted razor blades hidden in soap, sharpened combs, hot water mixed with sugar to create prison napalm. But the rage was always personal. Daryl believed every kill was deserved, and every time he struck, he looked the victim in the eyes and told them why. "You hurt her," he said once, before bashing in an inmate's skull with a weight plate. "So now I'm here to hurt you." Surveillance footage showed the entire murder, but it was so fast, so deliberate, the guards couldn't intervene in time. Blood sprayed across the gym floor like it had been planned for days, and maybe it had, because Daryl didn't just kill, he orchestrated warnings, messages written in blood or chalk. Victims left posed, hands clasped or heads tilted like macabre art. Prison psychologists deemed him untreatable. Other inmates refused to share a tear with him, Some guards, it said, even respected him, as twisted as that sounds, because Daryl never struck without reason. But make no mistake, he was not a vigilante. He was vengeance unbound, a man whose pain became prophecy, and every time he took a life, he believed it brought him closer to peace, or at least balance. By the time Daryl Knox claimed his 5th victim behind bars, the prison staff had stopped pretending he was just another violent inmate. They started calling him the Sermon because his murders always ended with a message. He didn't just kill to survive, he killed to teach. And in a place where mercy was a myth and brutality was currency, he preached consequence with every corpse. His 5th was different though. It wasn't rage that moved him, it was betrayal. An inmate named Race Monroe, a charming ex-cop doing time for evidence tampering, had gotten too close. Daryl never trusted lawmen, but Race had something most inmates didn't. He knew how to listen. Over months, the two shared stories through the bars, traded commissary, even watched each other's backs during yard duty. Race told Daryl about his fall from grace, about a partner who framed him, about a daughter who wouldn't take his calls anymore. Daryl, in turn, spoke of fire, of burned skin, of the way it felt to pull a dying man from smoke and hear nothing but silence in return. They weren't friends, but Daryl had started to think maybe, just maybe, he'd finally found someone who understood the kind of damage that hides behind good intentions. Then Race traded him. When a routine shakedown found a makeshift weapon hidden behind Daryl's sink, a shiv fashioned from a snapped bed frame bolt, it wasn't just a lucky bust. Daryl knew someone had snitched, and it didn't take him long to confirm what he already suspected. Race had tipped them off in exchange for early parole consideration. The betrayal shattered something deep inside Daryl. He didn't explode. He didn't scream. He simply smiled at Race from across the mess hall the next morning, a smile so calm it made 3 other inmates drop their trays and walk away. That night, Daryl began planning what would become his most precise kill. He bribed 2 inmates to fake a fight near the rec showers. The commotion drew the guards. While the chaos unfolded, Daryl accessed a restricted utility hallway by slipping a stolen key card, lifted weeks earlier from a careless janitor, into the emergency lock. He waited in the dark, behind a stack of rusted mop buckets, knowing that Race would be led down the same hallway on his way back from a post-rec check-in. When Race passed, Daryl struck. He didn't use a shiv or a weight plate. He used a piece of piano wire stolen from a broken rec room keyboard, looped tight and fast around Race's neck. But he didn't kill him quickly. He whispered in his ear, held him tight and said, "I gave you truth. You gave me silence." When it was over, Daryl didn't run. He dragged the body to the boiler room, stripped it, cleaned it, and propped it in a chair facing the main security camera. He placed Race's officer badge, the one he'd once bragged about hiding in his locker, on his chest like a medal. And beside it, written on the wall in black ash from the furnace, were the words, "All things burn." It took 6 guards to take Daryl down. He didn't resist. He laughed, not maniacally, but softly, as if the punchline had finally landed. He was sentenced to permanent solitary confinement, forbidden from ever interacting with another inmate again. But his legend only grew. Inmates told stories of him carving new weapons from toothpaste caps. Guards said he spoke to voices in the vents. One even claimed Daryl orchestrated 2 more assaults from isolation, passing coded messages through food trays. Whether that was true or not, Daryl became folklore inside those walls. And then, one day, he was gone. No announcement, no transfer logs. His cell was found empty during a midnight head count, the lock still sealed from the outside. The only trace left behind was a handprint, burned black into the wall, and a final message scratched into the concrete beneath his bunk. "All debts collected. I sleep now." The prison never recovered from the scandal. 3 guards were fired. An internal investigation found systemic negligence. And yet, no one ever found Daryl. Some say he escaped through the old plumbing tunnels. Others believe he faked his death, trading his own body for that of a deceased inmate during a fire drill. But most, even those who hated him, believe something darker, that Daryl Knox never really left, that he's still there, in the silence between doors slamming shut, in the shadow of every transfer, in the way the lights flicker at 3:07 a.m. And when an inmate disappears without explanation, they say just one thing: the sermon came. Because monsters don't always die. Sometimes they retire. They say prison is where killers go to rot. But for these 5 men, it became their hunting ground. Their cells were not cages, they were waiting rooms. Every echo down the corridor, every flicker of a failing light, every shuffle of boots across concrete floors was a warning. Because in a place built to contain monsters, these 5 proved something far worse: that the most dangerous predators don't need to escape. They just need time. And when time was all they had, they used it to send messages, in blood, in ash, in silence. So if you think justice ends at a locked door, think again. Because behind those bars, monsters don't die. They adapt, they plan, and sometimes they're still watching.